What's happening, hardscapers? This is episode 45 of the How to Hardscape podcast, where we talk to you about how you can start and grow your hardscaping business. And today we're joined by Matt Hostrander. He is a soil scientist here today to talk with us about soil identification and the importance of this subject in terms of preparing for and excavating your job site. This is an interview that was some great information for all types of landscapers, and we get technical in it, so buckle up. And without further ado, here's our interview with Matt Hostrander. Today I am joined by Matt Hostrander. He is a soil scientist, and he's here today to talk with us about soil and the importance of soil identification on any job site. Matt, thank you so much for joining me here.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
Let's just get started, Matt, to get to know a little bit more about yourself and what brought you into this industry and becoming a soil scientist. Can you give our audience a little bit of a background about that?
Well, no problem. First off, I am a soil scientist located in southeastern Pennsylvania. That's about an hour north of Philadelphia. For some of you, that may be known as the city of brotherly love, home to Rocky Balboa, if you're a Rocky fan, Independence Hall, and the Liberty Bell, just to name a few of the prominent locations, sites here outside of the city. I grew up on a hobby farm as a kid on 100 acres in central Pennsylvania. We had some Hereford cattle to fatten up and butcher for our family, as my dad had 5 brothers and sisters. We used the property to grow crops, woodlands to ride our three-wheelers. Yes, again, three-wheelers, not four-wheelers, so I survived that as a kid. My hometown in central Pennsylvania is Williamsport, which is known to Little League Baseball and the Little League World Series every year. As a kid, I did many outside activities on the land with my friends, neighbors. Everybody within a 5-mile radius was considered your neighbor out in the countryside. Being out in the country, I gained a lot of respect for Mother Nature and the soil. Because of that type of childhood, I decided to get a degree in agronomy and environmental science from a small private college down here in southeastern PA. After graduation, I was able to put my education to practice, but not after many years of learning from those in the field and from trial and error, good and bad, the ugly, right and wrong. 18 years later, I'm here discussing, hardscaping with you, Mike, and how I, started out as a kid in the woods, in the fields, to getting a degree, playing in the dirt and getting paid to do it.
Absolutely. And with all that, the way that your name came about to me was through Paver Pete. We were talking about soil identification and having somebody come on the show for that. He introduced me to you. And can you give us, our audience, myself, a little bit more understanding about how you work with Techoblock and a little bit of background on that?
Sure. I've worked with Paver Pete and Techoblock for at least 10 years, maybe more, as it relates to their permeable pavers or pavement systems, depending on how you say it. Generally, when I am working and preparing reports for them, I note it as a permeable pavement system. Prior to getting involved more personally with the company, I designed a lot of retaining walls that were Techoblock products, as well as many others that some of you in the hardscaping or landscaping industry would know of, that being E.P. Henry, which also has a manufacturing facility here in the state of Pennsylvania, just like Techoblock does, anchor wall systems, keystone wall systems, Mesa, and the list goes on and on. Generally speaking, with Techoblock, I performed permeability testing per the federal testing standards, which is called ASTM standards here in the States, on their permeable pavers, and have prepared reports for their literature in order to provide landscapers, contractors of all kinds, in some cases going out to regulators to see the importance of these products and how they can be used for mainly in stormwater management applications. In some cases, I've even tested soils beneath their permeable pavement systems as part of the whole design process on a couple of their showcase, projects. TechoBlock, again, is not the only manufacturer I have done permeability testing with, as I've performed this type of work for another block manufacturer that has been listed, but also a brick manufacturer from the southern part of the United States that has some very nice brick product that is also permeable in between the spacing and well known at places like the University of Pennsylvania that is located in the city of Philadelphia.
Gotcha. So needless to say, you've got a lot of experience in this industry. And this is why we wanted you to come on the show and to talk about soils, soil identification and everything that you do with that. So let's get started here to talk about identifying soils on our job site. Why is it so important for us to do this?
First off, it is very important to know the soil type you will be working with on any job site. I mean, you can get yourself knee deep in something prior to even getting started because you lack the knowledge or you don't know the area, you haven't looked up the information. Soils have many characteristics that can prove to be challenging when installing hardscape products on the soil. Some soils are sandier than others, which can provide suitable bearing surfaces and good subsurface drainage. However, there are soils with higher silt and clay contents, which can provide the opposite of that and make any project harder and more costly. It is also important to determine upfront how the on-site soils will potentially interact with the hardscaping system that you're going to install. For example, will the system be a permeable or impermeable installation? Meaning, is it going to be the permeable paver system with the aggregate in between the joint for infill, or is it going to be what we would most likely see as an impermeable, which are the pavers abutting each other, maybe with some tighter sand infill, or again touching each other where there is no real permeability of that product, and everything that hits it does sheet float off. For example, will the system be required to infiltrate stormwater runoff? Do you use a permeable product to provide that as part of an overall system setup for what is being done on a project? And then, of course, does that need to go through the product and then down into the subsoils? Will you be building a retaining wall line, backfilling the wall with residual soils? Will you need drainage tile? Very important things to know relative to what you have on the property to work with. Is it that sandy soil? Is it that silty soil, which is in the middle there? And then is it, the generally harder to work with clayey soil? Since I brought up I used to design retaining walls, a lot of retaining walls, from the 2002 to, 2008 or 2009 time period. Those were the ones that required geogrid. Because the walls were over 4 feet tall, where we actually had to do the engineering, run the engineering calculations, provide the geogrid lengths, what was required for the product, the drainage tile area, and all the information had to be put in order to, let's say, spit out, the proper parameters you needed for that type of wall, that product, where it was located. And again, one of the most important parts of that design process was looking at the reinforced zone, the retained zone, and the foundation zone. Of course, stone could be used in the foundation area or the reinforced zone, but many times the residual soils on a site, let's say you have an abundance of material you've taken out, moved around, but you want to reuse that and not have to bring in material. You want to have the engineering characteristics of that soil in order to be able to use it properly for whatever you're building. Same holds true, on those large projects as it does on the small projects where you're just putting in a hardscaping product, maybe a small landscaping wall. The information you need may not be as in-depth as an engineer type system, but nonetheless, it is still important for getting the project to the end without or let's say as the least amount of hiccups as possible.
So we talked a little bit there about permeable applications, impermeable applications, retaining walls, all these different things. And when it comes to the subgrade, whether it's heavy clay or it's a sandy subsoil in there, What does this mean to us as installers in, say, a permeable application? If we want water to go right through there, what does it mean if it's, say, a heavy clay content in that subsoil if we are installing a permeable application?
Oh, that's a good question, Mike. The best, as I talk about this, one of the best things to envision is, you have your sandy soils, which, you think of the beach, or you think of the area along the Great Lakes, where you have the water, going up and back and forth up against the beach area. The water goes in, it drains through the sand rather rapidly. And you can visualize that as a permeable material, if you will. And that's a coarse sand for the most part. Then when you go to the opposite end of the spectrum, think about modeling clay. And, most of us has played with that as kids in school. Maybe some of us do it as a hobby. And you have the sand. It's like sands of the hourglass, just falling through your fingers as you hold it. Now, you try to do that with modeling clay, it's not going to go anywhere. And, the same holds true when you're looking at the characteristics of, hey, the sand drains the water rapidly along the beach. But that modeling clay is going to be like a bowl. It's gonna hold that water. It's going to be a lot slower of a permeability. Yes, it will do something. Can we measure that in a day? Hours, weeks? It all depends on how clayey that material is. But generally speaking, as I stated, the sandier soils have a higher permeability than what we call finer grained material, which are those silts and clays. In most cases, it's beneficial to have a professional document the soil conditions on the property below those permeable applications in order to determine if infiltration will work or whether the water will have to be captured, kind of like that bowl, of modeling clay, if you will, and redirected someplace else. In clayey soils, this will most likely be to capture or retain infiltrating stormwater, again, to put it in a different location at a slower rate. In sandy soils, there's a good chance that infiltration will work below your, let's say, subbase material, that subgrade of sandy soils, but there are some reasons that it may not. Those reasons could be that the sandy soils are compacted or dense. Maybe they have what we in soils call platy structure. And you can, assimilate that to looking at a plate, and holding it in your hand and imagining it's a soil structural unit and water hits the top of the plate. It's going to want to move sideways as opposed to penetrate that platy condition because it limits the downward, movement of that infiltrating water. And again, sandy soils, are generally good when it comes to infiltration, but there can be finer grained sands, which, and let's not talk about the beach sand that's, really nice and coarse. Water just flows right through it. It drains through your fingers when you hold it. But the finer grained sands can actually be a slower permeability, kind of like a silt. But in some cases, sandy soils can act like saprolite. Now that's, more of a geologic term, but saprolite is still rock, if you will, weathering into, in this case, a sandy soil. So the saprolite sands that are in place, they look great, but when you pull them out, they're actually harder. They break up, or explode in your hand because they're more like a rock structure, which actually slows down the permeability in a material that you think looks great when it comes out, but in place, it actually has, hard structure or poor structure that decreases, the amount of water that can go through it. So the answer of your question in the long way around there is it safe to say that one would not need to worry about infiltration in sandy soil? Well, the answer is no. If there's one thing I've learned in the field over the past 18 years is don't judge a soil by its texture or structure. It can fool you. If you really want to know, you have to do the proper testing to determine the parameters you have to work with, like in situ or in place infiltration testing, which is one of the things as a soil scientist that I do on a regular basis for stormwater management. be it in the soil, but in cases of hardscaping, have done for Techoblock and other manufacturers to show that what they produce and install for these pavement systems do work.
Gotcha. So that was a lot of great information in there, and it brings up a little point in my head in terms of satisfying my curiosity with this question. If you are a contractor working in a small confined area, going no more than say 25 miles out of your way for any given job, so a small radius of work, is it safe to say that the soil that you're working with is going to be consistent throughout that radius, or what have you seen in your experience?
Okay, well, soils can change in 50 feet. Here in southeastern Pennsylvania, we have ridges and valleys, if you will. And, looking at from a geology standpoint, soils come from a lot of different methods, if you will, one of those being parent material. So if you have a red rock parent material, you may have a red soil. But at the same time, let's say you go down the hill on a piece of property and it changes to something that was deposited by erosion or deposited by moving water near stream banks. And that can be in the same, geological formation, for example, or it can be a change from a silty rock, a finer grained, siltstone, which is sedimentary, to a sandstone that's maybe a coarser type of a sand that gives you those nice coarser grained sand particles in your soil. And then you could totally change that to a nice or schist bedrock, for example, in some hillier country that is totally different than a sedimentary rock, has different minerals in it, which can then give you different soils. And the way that soils can, change over topography, over climates, the length of time it's taken to be there, all takes place in order to change the soils. So yes, if you work in a 25-mile radius, I can just, think of that here in my head, in a 25-mile radius. There's totally different types of soil that have come from a handful, if not two handfuls of depositional reasons, glacial reasons, alluvial, which moved by water. And again, there's the dry ones and there's the wet ones. And there's a lot of things that we have to take into consideration when we're going to a site or, researching a site that, yes, you may know the area, but that doesn't necessarily mean what you're going to find on the property is what you think it's going to be.
And that just makes it so much more important to know your soils before you start that excavation and to get into this. So let's get back on track here and ask you, when should we be identifying the soils? Is it before a quote, before an excavation, at another time? How should we be going about this?
So I believe any contractor that works with the soil, installs products on the soil, etc., should be aware of the type of soil and rock that will be encountered on any one of their projects. Being familiar with the local soil and geology is vital to keeping the projects on track and on budget, and in my opinion, and that's from experience. What if the site soils are clay that we've talked about? They stay very wet, and they have to be removed. I mean, they're just bad, and you can't deal with them. What's that going to be, cost-wise? What's that going to be time-wise? What if that wasn't included in your scope and fee? What if the site has shallow bedrock? We can run into that a number of times where I'm located, just because of the nature of the Appalachians, the Appalachian Mountains, and the weathering that has gone on, and farming practices. That bedrock can be shallow to the surface. Was that fee and time to remove some of that? Again, that's larger projects, bigger excavations, as opposed to, we need to just take out 2 feet and install our permeable product. How does a contractor work that out with the client and potentially fix a timeline that was missed because of this extra work that's required that they didn't necessarily see? Yes, sometimes it happens, but if there's a way to get it all figured out first, that's going to be better for you and better for the client, and better for everyone in the long run. So the longer answer is, before you quote a job, would be the time to identify the soils. One easy way to do that here in the States is to use soil mapping. That can be found in a soil survey manual. I keep copies of the old, 1975 soil survey here for Bucks County on hand. If I need to see some stuff, maybe flip some pages, smell the oldness of it, as opposed to using the online version. Here in the States, we have what's called Web Soil Survey. Some of you here in the United States may have used that in the past. I use it all the time. It's our national soil survey mapping tool that was produced and is updated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is and then the wing of the Natural Resource Conservation Service, helps to keep that up to date and running at all times so that people can look at their area, other areas that they want to go to. Or I am sure if contractors have worked in an area long enough, they'll become accustomed to the soil types and geology in their area. But for the new contractor, let's say it's somebody who just moved there or somebody new out of university or at a tech school that doesn't know what lies beneath, if you will. Utilizing published or online resources is a must. As a soil scientist, I use soil and geology mapping a lot, generally before I go to any site or when I'm writing proposals, just so I can, get my fingers wet on what's really going to be needed. Also, it helps me, provide feedback to who I'm going to be working with to give them some upfront information, let them know I know what I'm doing or that I've done my, background research. It may give some reassurance to the people that you're going to be working with when you have those things at your fingertips. Again, working here, on the East Coast in the States, some areas are familiar. Then there are those that I don't get to often, where the research that I do prior to going is very useful. One example would be when I went to Montreal to do permeability testing on Techoblock's permeable pavers or their, permeable pavement systems. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. So doing the research up front helped me understand the soils in that area and how they formed. This was the first time, actually, that I reviewed the information from the Canadian Soil Information Service. So it was a very useful tool. Again, don't typically cross the border. They did leave me back in. So it was a worthwhile experience, but also, a worthwhile one to utilize new ways of gathering information that I'm not used to.
And some great resources that you talked about there in identifying these soils that you're going to come across. So what are the most common soils that we will come across as a contractor in North America?
All right. Well, you always have these hard questions, Mike. It all depends on the region or, where you're located. North America is a big continent. Obviously, we have Canada, we have the United States, and then we have Mexico. We can't forget them down there at the bottom. And since it's so large, it has many microclimates, depositional forces and results of those forces, topographical changes. Just to name several reasons, soils can vary widely across our continent. However, in order to understand a little bit more on how soils are formed, let me tell you the 5 soil forming factors. And not to bore you, but this is what I learned back in college, here in Pennsylvania, which once you understand all this and you can visualize it, you're like, oh, okay, well, this better helps me understand on why it is I'm looking at where I'm looking at it, and how it got there. Soils are formed by 1, climate, 2, topography, 3, time, 4, this is a fun one, biota, I'll explain that in a minute, and 5, parent material. Climate, think of the differences between cold and hot, dry and wet weather. There'll be some of us here in, Pennsylvania where, we kind of have a mix of all of those things, different than as you go into Canada, where you may have more colder regimes. And it's going to be different in Arizona, especially, with the type of soil you're going to be working with, just because the nature of that dry climate. You have topography. Soils are going to range vastly when looking at ground floor soils near sea level and stream banks, for example, to those on the tops of mountains, let's say 10,000 feet in the air. Time. So remember, the Himalayas are the tallest mountains now, but it may have been the Appalachian Mountains that are located here in the States from Georgia through New York state, where, our mountains are a lot, smaller now, maybe maxing out in the 6,000 foot range, which is a far cry from, well into the 20,000s in the Himalayas and, of course, Mount Everest. So time can have a significant effect on the soils that have been generated as part of those weathering forces. Biota. Okay, this means plants and animals, if anybody wondered. The impact, of course, that they have on the soil. You have, all types of different plants, and their growth, their decay, their help in keeping soils in place, from erosion. You have animals. Animals eat a lot, but they also go to the bathroom a lot. So, that helps to provide, essential, nutrients. Getting things back into the soil can make it more fertile, but there are also impacts from, let's say, high intensity grazing or farming operations that can have a, in some cases, detrimental impact to the soils and how they formed over time. And lastly, the parent material. So earlier I brought up the fact that, hey, we've got red rock. We're going to have red soil, but there are other forces, that can lead to, yes, we have red rock at the surface, but why do we have soils that look totally different above it? When you have a red rock substratum, if you will, but we have tan, gray, brown, surface soils. And I'll get to that here in a minute. So here on the East Coast, we see a lot of silts and sands and varying amounts of clay and rock fragments. That changes when you get from the sandy shores. Let's say what we bring up a lot here on the East Coast, the Jersey Shore in the state of New Jersey, or the mountain regions that can have more sand and gravels. So in Pennsylvania, we have, from the gamut of sand, to the silts to the really crappy clay, if you will. But then you think about New Jersey, which has a lot of sandier material because of the beaches and the close to the ocean. But then you could think about, okay, sandy and gravelly soils in the mountainous regions of Vermont or New Hampshire. And again, the weathering parent material that they come from. The amount of clay, which, generally is the one that hurts permeability, since we're talking about permeable applications, can change quickly. But we don't have what we call shrink and swell clays that they have down in the south or the midwestern part of the United States, where you see the large cracking as the clay soils dry out and swell up again during drought and or wet conditions. Again, those types of soils were seen in those heavy clays, if you will, were seen in Montreal. And when I was on that site, I got to see how they did some of that work, and the differences of, what I'm used to here and what I see there, were pretty interesting or extensive, if you will. That's where I got to see that they use a little bit of concrete or grout. I've seen them use the gator-based products to lay out their bedding or to help with their stability of their systems. Again, that was the clay that you could make into any kind of artwork or sculpture that you wanted while I was out in the field. And it comes down to not only, is it that location along, let's say, the St. Lawrence Seaway or in an area that's got, big mountains that have eroded over time. There are those soils that have been translocated by wind and have a high silt content because sand, too heavy to move, clay, too sticky to move. But then there's the wind that can actually pick up the silts, like the Great Dust Bowl back in the 30s here in the States, that picked up the material and dropped the material. And that's where you can have those what we call discontinuities. And, hey, we have a red rock, bedrock here. Why in the world is this soil yellow? And again, it got there from someplace else. The same with those soils moved by water or those that have been glaciated. You can think of, glaciation did make it down here into the States, into upper part of Pennsylvania, as a part of, Canada having to deal with the same types of soils that have been deposited by, moving glaciers and receding glaciers. And again, soil mapping is a great tool to help you out with all of that and to kind of navigate okay, this is what I think we're going to get, or okay, this is not what I'm used to. Help me out. You can, find out some of the parameters that you may need to understand. But sometimes just getting in the trench, so to speak, is the only way to confirm what you'll be dealing with during construction.
Absolutely, and it's great to get this background information to understand this a little bit more in depth. And we talked about it a little bit, the characteristics of these different soils, but can you talk a little bit more, expand a little bit more on, what the characteristics are of these different soils that you've brought up?
Sure. And in order to make, the answer worthwhile, I will have to answer, of course, a little more technically, as opposed to, common speak, if you will. The soils can consist of varying amounts of sand, silt, clay, air, water, organic matter. You put these all things together, it's a soil. It's not just what we've talked about, that sand particle or that silt particle or that clay particle. I'm going to leave out rock fragments because that's just let's say, modifier. It's what you add to the soil to say, hey, we have this amount of rock in our soil, but it doesn't make up the soil itself, because it's rock, not soil at that point. The sand, silt, and clay particles are the mineral constituents of the soil, generally coming from the weathering of in-place parent material, or again, those wind-blown materials or water-moved materials. In a perfect soil, and again, back to my college days, we had a little pie chart that showed this, that the soil, if it was perfect, was 45% mineral soil, coming from the earth, if you will, weathering from the rock. 5% organic matter, that's going to be, the leaf litter, the grass decomposition, the animals going to the bathroom, all that working into the organics of the soil, the little worms. And then you have your 25% water and 25% air. So when you put that all together, that's 100% of a perfect soil. Each of these components plays a role in determining the soil type. Of course, its permeability, its workability, that sand and clay difference, and its growth potential, nutrient uptake. I could bore you to death on soil fertility and everything like that. But, when you put it all together, there's a lot more than, just is it sand, silt, or clay. However, in order to shed some light on the main differences, I'll review the main characteristics we describe in the field. As a soil scientist going out to any job site, for example, I was on a stormwater project today where I have to go out and not only run testing to confirm that the soils will or will not infiltrate stormwater runoff, I actually have to describe, the whole soil profile and what I'm looking at. We have our sand, silts, and clays that have different textures. Sands are rough. Silts are like butter. Clays are sticky. That's one of our ways to do the field testing method, or besides visually, but by feel. What are we working with? I can't take the lab with me out into the field and run a lab test to tell me empirically this is exactly the soil that I'm working with. We have a general understanding of the parameters, the field test. Does it make a ribbon in your hand when you squeeze it, to determine those characteristics? To come up with that texture. The soils in place can have different structures and consistencies that can relate to their permeability and or workability. Sandy soils are generally more permeable and easier to work with throughout moisture conditions and outside weather conditions. Silts are moderate, and clays, contrary, are the worst. If they're wet, you're not going to do anything with them. If they're dry, same holds true as like a brick. So it's not very easy to work with. Soil structure, like platiness, shows that there may have been past compaction of the soil. Wind-blown deposition that layered it in over time can give you some platy structure. Or there just may be general weathering in place of harder rock that can give you some platy structure that we may describe in the field. Back to that saprolite comment earlier where, it looks like rock, but it looks like soil, but then you take it out and it's not soil. It explodes or crushes in your hand, that it's more of a rock structural. unit. And again, those platy structures will have slower permeability, generally speaking, and it just hinders that downward mobility of infiltrating water to move down the soil profile. Sandy soils, as we talk about the differences, may be the best soil type to work with in the field while installing hardscaping products. As I'm sure most of you have installed over time, a lot of these products can have sand sub-bases or a bedding layer, if you will. So you think of it that way, how, you lay it out, you tamp it or flatten it out, and you put your product on it. Same can hold true if it's a residual sandy soil, not something that you are, that's manufactured and you're bringing to the site. But sandy soil can be great from a workability standpoint or a permeability standpoint. But then let's think about restoration of the workspace, for example. This is where sandy soils may not fare so well, as they generally lack the nutrients, water holding capacity. They need to grow grass, or you put shrubs in them, around your hardscaped area to make it look nice. And therefore, amending these sandy soils, maybe with some silt, maybe with some clay, maybe with some organic or peat, may help in getting that soil that may be missing those kinds of, growth media, those nutrients to be better for the other aspect of the project, not under the hardscaping, but, as the rest of your overall scope or your overall, landscaped area that you've been working on. The sandy soils themselves would be great at draining all of the, let's say, nutrients you put in there. They're great at infiltrating water, let's say, but, if you were going to grow something in them, the contrary, may actually happen. That, it hurts you in that aspect. So what you put in doesn't live. And then you got to come back and fix all that stuff. So each type of soil has its pros and cons, for the type of work, the contractor is performing, and can always be modified for the task at hand with the knowledge of what is needed and what that specific result is that you're going for. Is it the workability, under your hardscaped product? Is it, the periphery, of your overall landscaping plan that you're working with, and understanding how, different aspects of that sand, silt, or clay, or that organic matter that may be lacking, and how that all, works into, the different aspect to your product. So you can't just think of it as I'm going with hardscaping in mind when, in fact, there's other things that, go into that type of project itself, where you have to be able to take, multiple parameters or a multiple understanding of what you're working with, and how changing different things can have a different outcome.
Gotcha. And this is great information, not just for hardscapers, but landscapers in general. Just lots of awesome information that you're pouring out to us here, Matt. And coming to more of a close here, you talked a little bit about preparing soils and, different things that you can do in order to get ready for installation. Can you talk about that a little bit more? What can we do to these soils in order to prepare them for, say, a base installation for hardscaping?
Well, in order to know what to do to the on-site soils to prepare them for your sub-base installation, one must know, circle back here, what type of soil that's there. Depending on the soil's sand, silt, and clay percentages, vastly different methods and or materials will be needed to prepare a site. Don't forget about the rock fragments. I brought that up a little bit ago, that we don't tend to think about, rock fragments or rock, pieces, gravels, flat rocks, those types of things, being, in the soil or describing the soil. But they can play a key role, in getting a soil subgraded, or subgrade compacted, and ready to go. From dealing with, engineered, retaining wall systems, or let's say backfill areas on project sites, actually having, some type of rock fragment, be it a gravel or some flat rock, actually, just like an aggregate, a stone that has fines in it. You stick all that together, big pieces, little pieces, it actually helps things compact really well. So as mentioned earlier, sandy soils are generally the easiest to work with because they don't hold the moisture as much as long. They're easier to compact. They can make the subgrade soils a breeze to work with, but add a little silt or clay to the mix and the outcome may be different. Silts and clays tend to hold more water and need to be at optimum moisture content. There's a moisture curve, if you will, when it comes to compaction there's like a dartboard. You gotta, shoot for the middle and hopefully you get it. Because, then it could be, more time, more labor intensive, to get you to that result for your best, base, compaction or installation. It's because the sands can be, bam, we're done. We've got okay moisture conditions, but it's easier to work with. But then there's the silts and clays that hold that water longer. But the more you work with it, clay can become squishy. And then, water comes to the surface. And then you have to come up with plan B or plan C on how to, work with those conditions that may have been there or that you may have started by doing too much, let's say, rolling or compacting. For jobs that require working with wetter soils or soils with higher silt and clay contents, not every site's sand or every site's perfect, that you have to be, ready to and understand. You have to be open to using geotextiles, fabrics, aggregate, concrete slurries, or other proprietary products that would get you to that, base installation standpoint. Working with design engineers, being open to that. You may not know everything there is that, could get you to that proper, let's say it's a larger scale, parking area, going to have some heavier vehicles on it. Having a geotechnical professional provide you some information, some engineering data for geotextiles like GeoGrid, or needing to put what we call bridging aggregate in a clayey soil or a very wet soil with water in it to get you up to where you need to be to give you that firm, stable subbase to work with. So soils and wet subsoils, can wreak havoc on your job site. But there are products out there. We talked about the Gator Base. I saw that firsthand in Montreal on one of TechoBlock's projects. You just need to know when to use them. When is the good time? Is it the right time for this product? Or, could we use something else that's maybe it's more labor intensive. Maybe it's better for the project. But you just need to, I guess, kind of have that toolbox open and be ready to pull from it. Don't be afraid to consult your local design professional, local soil scientist professional like myself, for example, when the need arises to provide, that firm, that stable subgrade when the soils aren't cooperative. Most likely someone has dealt with it before and knows the answer.
Absolutely, and I can definitely see, in those larger projects where engineering's involved and communicating with your local soil scientist can be so helpful. What about for those smaller jobs? As we close out this interview, is there any piece of equipment or anything that us contractors that only, say, do smaller jobs, a driveway, patio, backyard patio, whatever it may be, that we can invest in to kind of help us with our soil identification?
The easiest thing that anybody that wants to be a little dangerous can do, if you will, can obviously research what is supposed to be there, from a desktop analysis, and can give you some information on the type of soil that's going to be there. But just the general, understanding of, and there's, ways from, let's say, the USDA, that NRCS website, there's feedback or, information on there that can help the regular person that doesn't have a soil science, background or degree in understanding a little bit more about the soil that they're working with. Is it a sandier soil? Is it a siltier soil? Is it a clayey soil? And how do we work with it? A lot of it just comes down to, looking at it, to, playing with it, in your hand, trying to mold it. How does it interact with, actually, surprisingly, your hand, your skin? As I had mentioned earlier in the conversation about the sand, the silt, and the clay. What's the difference? We know what a sand particle looks like. We know how it feels and the grittiness, next to your ear when you play with it, when they rub together. Then you have the silt, which when dry is almost like talc powder, but when it's wet, it's more like butter. And then when you have clay, Clay, sticks to your hand. You can make the little worms, the little, soil worms between your hands. And clay will stain you. That's where you're looking at your hand comes into play, where, the sands and silts, it doesn't really deposit that color or that stickiness to your hand like a clay will. So it's hard for me to, say what kind of product out there would necessarily help you with, determining the soils in the field. Yeah, there's definitely lots of, laboratory, type grade equipment. But what it comes down to is being receptive to the information that you've gotten from published resources, to, the other contractors that have worked in that area, to someone like me, other professionals, engineers, geologists, that you can, listen to them. How do they figure it out? Do they use the published sources? Do they, only rely on the hand and visual method? No, we don't chew it. We don't taste it, contrary to popular belief. You can smell it though. But, generally speaking, as I said earlier, with these types of, even regular sized projects, there's not always a need to, send something to a laboratory that's going to give you definitive information, that tells you what sand, silt, and clay, rock, water content, nutrient content, all that information is. But if you're just going out there and building your small, neighbor needs a patio, neighbor needs a walkway, or they want that nice permeable, driveway, you just have to be open to, receiving, educational information from those that have done it in the past, those knowledgeable in it. You have to be understanding of, does this need to infiltrate? Does it not need to infiltrate? Is the water just going to go in a pipe and go someplace else if it's permeable? Or if it's permeable, it's supposed to go into the ground and not go out onto the street, or, discharge into a stream. And understanding the soil from this is what I found online. This is what I know, playing with it in my hand, or this is what the farmer next door told me. That information is great, but you just have to be open to, asking, being able to ask that question to the proper person, because, I don't take anything out into the field with me. If I am concerned or don't understand something, I may have to take it back with me, and learn more about it. You're not necessarily going to understand or figure it out, by looking at the computer, by looking at it, in the field. You may have to do a little bit of follow-up research or understanding. But from a let's go out and play in the dirt standpoint, you go out to a site and you see that, it feels like sand, or look at this, I can make a statue out of it that, these are the type of constituents that I'm working with, and just, being a common sense. But it comes down to knowing what you have to work with, and knowing the right steps to work with it, and putting it into practice. You can't know it and not do it. Listening to somebody who's done it before, or listening to that person who's been educated in it, may be your most valuable resource in that area. And you may have to do the same thing if you go to a totally different area and you're not familiar with it. But it's called hardscaping, not hard-headed. So you want to be receptive to, because I'm even though I'm a soil scientist, somebody may have done something in a different area that I'm not familiar with, that they can provide me with the insight. Just like when I went to Montreal and didn't know what I was going to be looking at, what type of soils are there, what the depositional forces were, and looking it up so that I can have that general understanding and know that I'm going to go there and look at a brick in the ground, as opposed to beach sand.
And Matt, this was such a great interview to get some more knowledge, especially for myself, on soil identification and its meaning on a job site, because it's just a great topic to cover as we continue into talking about excavation and base preparation on the podcast. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining us here on this podcast.
You are very welcome. And if anybody wants more boring information about my background or knowledge of soils, I do have a LinkedIn page that I can be found under Matt or Matthew Hostrander. My cell phone number's on there, same country code as Canada. My email address is listed in there for any specific questions. comments. It may not be, right around the corner for me, but it may be something that somebody's already asked me or that I've already dealt with that, ask the question and hopefully I'll have an answer for it, Mike.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast episode. Visit us at howtohardscape.com for more information on this subject. Let us know what you want to learn about in future episodes by reaching out to us on our social channels. We are at howtohardscape on Facebook and Instagram, or send us an email at contact@howtohardscape.com. And we'd love it if you subscribe to this podcast. Let us a rating and review. It really helps us get this podcast out there into more people's ears and attract some great guests moving forward to deliver you more value. And we look forward to meeting with you next week on the How to Hardscape podcast.